Sarah comes to ETH from Spain. She did her bachelor's, master's, and PhD all at the University of Barcelona in Spain. And as will be evident from her presentation, her primary focus of her PhD was to explore the sedimentological and biogeochemical consequences of bottom trawling on the seafloor, with a focus on primarily on the Mediterranean Sea, where these fishing activities are quite extensive. And this is another topic which is garnering a lot of attention in the media, and Sarah will be able to give us a nice overview of the significance of this, and also what its relevance may be with respect to the Namibian system. So over to you, Sarah.
Okay, then. Well, thank you, Kurt, for inviting me to give this talk on the sedimentological and biogeochemical impacts of bottom trawling on the seafloor. So the keywords of my presentations are the following: sediment, mixing or suspension, erosion, which are all physical impacts of bottom trawling on the seafloor, geomorphology, and biogeochemistry. So before we start, I wanted to just give a brief overview of what the ocean gives to us. So Tim just started with how the seafloor can, by accumulating carbon and sequestering carbon, serves as a regulatory service for climate regulation. But when we think about the ocean, we usually think of the provisional services and, most importantly, food in the terms of fisheries. And the kind of fishery that is most important is bottom trawling. And the thing is, bottom trawling occurs in virtually all continental margins. It is estimated that 75% of continental margins are being trawled at least once a year. And although there are different types of bottom trawling gear, I will be focusing on this kind of bottom trawling gear, which are called otter trawls. And they consist on dragging along these heavy nets along the seafloor, and that are held open by these two heavy doors. Since bottom trawling targets demersal fisheries, it is designed to be in continuous contact with the seafloor. So as you can imagine, it is bound to have several impacts on the carbon stocks on the seafloor. But before I started, Tim just mentioned that there has been a recent paper, a Nature paper, that addressed how protecting the global ocean for biodiversity, securing food and climate, raised the awareness of the impacts of bottom trawling, because when assessing the impacts on climate, they were focusing on how the seafloor serves as an important site for carbon storage, and when it's being disturbed, for instance, by bottom trawling, it can release vast amounts of CO2 through remineralization. But through different assumptions, this study estimated a staggering amount of 1.5 petrograms of carbon that is being emitted through CO2 emissions. And the thing is, this study, there are very few studies that have addressed the impacts of bottom trawling on the seafloor. So it is impressive that they could do such calculations of estimations of CO2 emissions. And it got, as Tim just mentioned, it got a lot of media attention, and they compared bottom trawling activities to air travels. And well, this went in different newspapers all over the world. So as you can imagine, it got a lot of attention. But before I go into the impacts of bottom trawling on biogeochemical aspects, I want to highlight that the impacts of bottom trawling are not new. They have been studied for decades, and initially they were mostly focused on the ecological impacts of how bottom trawling causes higher mortality, changes benthic community structure, and then they realized that it's by affecting the ecology, they're also modifying the sediment biogeochemistry. It is a very intertwined field, because by trawling activity can cause a shift of the benthic community, which can also modify sediment composition, but also trawling can modify sediment composition, and this can have a consequence on benthic assemblage structure. So this is a close link. And even more recently, the impacts of the physical alterations on the seafloor, the geological impacts, have also been taken into account to understand how bottom trawling can modify sediment biogeochemistry. And now I will be only focusing on these two, how the geological alterations can modify sediment biogeochemistry. But I want to highlight that it is a link between these three different fields. So the most direct physical impact that bottom trawling can cause on the seafloor is the generation of trawl marks, which is mostly caused by the trawling doors. The trawl doors can dig in the seafloor, generating these furrows and then creating a lateral displacement of sediment. And if you're interested in this topic, there's a recent Marie Curie individual fellowship that has been granted to one of my coworkers from Barcelona, Dr. Ruth Duran, and you can check out her work at trawledseas.eu. The continuous contact of bottom trawling gear on the seafloor also causes sediment resuspension, and this is mostly caused by the trawl doors, despite that the nets are the ones that have a greatest surface contact with the seafloor. And this is because the digging action of the trawl doors, along with the hydrodynamic turbulence caused by the configuration of the trawling doors, are capable of resuspending much more sediment. And now this sediment resuspending by bottom trawling is so important that it can even be seen when trawling occurs in shallow environments through satellite imagery. This resuspended sediment can then be advected away, causing net erosion of fishing grounds. Now, as you can imagine, all these different physical alterations have a biogeochemical consequence. And I'm briefly going to summarize them in this sketch of, here we have the seafloor. We have a trawl door that is being dragged along the seafloor. And the first impact, as I mentioned, is generation of the furrows through sediment compaction and then the lateral displacement of sediment. All of this also causes sediment reworking, and this basically causes the oxygenation of the seafloor of the sediment, which can increase the degradation and then hence reduce the amount of the labile organic matter compounds that are found on the seafloor. As I mentioned, there's also sediment resuspension. And in some instances, only the finest grained sediment is preferentially advected, whereas the coarser sediment, such as sands, are redeposited on fishing grounds. This is called winnowing. And since this fine-grained sediment tends to be enriched in organic matter, during this winnowing of this fine-grained sediment, we can reduce the amount of organic matter that is found on the seafloor. Now, altogether, bottom trawling can just eventually erode the seafloor, and taking with it any the sediment from the seafloor, which has organic matter. And altogether, this will eventually just remove organic matter from the seafloor. Now, the fate of this organic matter that's being resuspended could simply be redeposited somewhere else, but also by increasing the transit time of this organic matter that had been already deposited on fishing grounds, can then enhance its degradation until being redeposited on the fishing ground, elsewhere, I mean. So now, there are only, based on literature research, there are only 37 studies that have studied the biogeochemical impacts of bottom trawling on the seafloor. And from these, they all have different aims. So only 12 studies have basically observed how, compared whether trawling grounds are depleted in organic matter compounds in comparison to control sites. 20 of them, the majority of them, have been focused on the ecological implications of bottom trawling and how the alterations of sediment biogeochemistry affect the ecology. And only 10 have assessed the link between the physical geological alterations and the biogeochemical impacts. And what I want to highlight from this map is that there are very inconsistent results. So some studies have shown that there aren't any differences, statistically significant differences between trawled sites and untrawled sites in terms of organic matter composition. And what I mean by organic matter is any kind of proxy. So it can be organic carbon, total nitrogen, chlorophyll A, organic matter assessed through loss over on ignition, anything. Whereas other studies have shown a decrease in organic matter compounds in trawling grounds in comparison to control sites, and others even an increase. And not only that, but aside from these studies, which were meant to assess the impacts of bottom trawling, I found even 10 more studies that could only explain the results based on a possibility of the influences of bottom trawling nearby. And this is actually to be expected, considering the vast expanse of bottom trawling grounds all over continental margins. I think it's very hard to study a site and not take into account this anthropogenic activity that is very ubiquitous. So these inconsistent results don't basically show how difficult it is to how variable the environment is and the impacts can be. So it's very difficult to do to extrapolate the studies such as the Nature paper that came out last month, because maybe in each areas they have different trawling gear types or different frequencies, trawling frequencies, or the sampling time after a trawler has passed by can also modify the outcomes, as well as the environment factors such as sediment grain size, the organic matter accumulation, that is how much organic matter, the rate of organic matter that is reaching the seafloor can also modify these results, as well as the hydrodynamics. Now, I believe that these environmental factors can sort of be summarized with depth, because all of these factors change with increasing depth. So in shallow environments, such as continental shelves, there are sediment suspension caused by trawling activities coexist also with natural sediment suspension mechanisms. So, and studies have even shown that they suspend comparable volumes of sediment. Also, benthic communities are used to these high hydrodynamics and these natural disturbances. So the impacts shown in shallow environments tend to be lower relative to those in deeper environments, where hydrodynamics are, as Tim also mentioned, there are fewer and less intense, so that the main mechanism for sediment suspension now has become bottom trawling has become the main mechanism for sediment suspension. And the organic matter accumulation in depth tends to decrease, and ecosystems also tend to have lower resiliency, basically because they usually consist of slow-growing organisms. Now, studies assessing the impacts of deep bottom trawling are even scarcer. There are only 4 study sites in a total of 8 studies. Most of them, and some of them, focus on the interaction between the geological impacts and others through the ecological. I will explain to you the impacts that we studied in the Catalan margin and Sicilian margin, which was part of my thesis. And we studied the link between the geological and biogeochemical impacts. And then I will just explain the one study that has been done in the Benguela Upwelling System, which I believe is most of your interest. So in the first study site is the Sicilian margin in the Gulf of Castellamare, here in northern Sicily. Here, there's a trawl ban in the inner Gulf, so bottom trawling can only occur in deeper continental slopes between 500 and 700 meters. We collected a sediment core here and then in this intensively trawled area, and in a non-trawled site here beyond. And we also got ROV images from this trawled site here and from the untrawled site here. And as you can see, in the untrawled seafloor, we can see several bioturbation mounds, whereas in the trawled site, we see several trawl marks. From these sediment cores, we analyze a series of proxies. I won't go into details, but I only want you to focus that in the trawled site shown in red, we could only find excess lead-210 and excess thorium-234 concentrations in the upper 2 centimeters, which shows, and below that there wasn't anything, which shows that bottom trawling had eroded a century worth of sediment, and only these two first centimeters had been freshly accumulated. Now, the concentration profiles of organic carbon, total nitrogen, show that the trawled site is significantly depleted in these compounds in comparison to the untrawled site. And in the first upper 2 centimeters, there's a slight increase. Oops, sorry. And but concentrations became similar in depth only in sections that had accumulated over a century ago. In terms of the organic matter composition here shown in this pie plot of proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates, we see that the composition of the untrawled sites is similar to just the first centimeter of the trawled site, which is the layers that had been freshly deposited. And in the phytopigments, so the most labile compounds, was very similar in both sites, only in this freshly deposited layer, whereas in depth, the trawled site was significantly depleted. So this shows that the freshly deposited sediment in the trawled site had similar organic matter composition and nutritional quality to the control site. And interestingly, only these freshly deposited sediment had a higher turnover rates in the trawled sites in comparison to untrawled site, which shows that the arrival of fresh and nutritious sediment had stimulated microbial response. Now, this study wouldn't have been possible if only assessing the biogeochemical impacts of only biogeochemical proxies and leaving aside these physical geological proxies. And the take-home message from this study is that bottom trawling uproots aged and organic carbon poor sediment, but that the arrival of fresh and nutritious organic matter in this completely starved and organic carbon poor seafloor had enhanced degradation. In the second study site is the Catlin margin, which, as you can see, is incised by several submarine canyons, and all of these canyons support important bottom trawling grounds along the flanks, also in deeper environments between 300 and 800 meter depth. And the studies here are very numerous, mostly addressing the geological impacts, but most of them have been centered in Palamos Canyon. So I will just give you a brief summary of these studies. So this is the Palamos Canyon, and the trawl grounds are shown in gray. And so they trawl along the northern flank and partly along the southern flank. And during that study, they collected sediment cores along the northern flank and the southern flank. And they observed through excess lead-210 inventories that the trawling grounds are completely eroded in comparison to the untrawled site. They also observed that sand content was significantly higher in the trawled site in comparison to the untrawled site, indicating a winnowing of finer grained sediment. And the authors of this study then created these 4 different sites. And the first one being closest to the shore, where trawling-induced erosion is counterbalanced by high deposition rates. And further offshore, erosion and winnowing prevailed. And this other site, it was like an intermediate between these 2 sites. And then finally, in the non-impacted control ground, there was high sedimentation rates and bioturbation. Studies during the sampling cruises also show that trawling grounds had low organic carbon and labile carbon on trawling grounds, and that there was a shift in benthic community structure towards more opportunistic species. However, these studies didn't address whether there were changes in organic carbon composition, and soon after publishing these papers, fishermen decided to take a seasonal trawling closure of 2 months, from January to February, so inclusive. And so this gave us the perfect opportunity to see what were the effects of these seasonal trawling closure and whether the seafloor was capable of recovering during this closure. So we collected sediment cores in this trawled site here and this untrawled site here. And we analyzed organic carbon, total nitrogen, and a series of biomarkers with different reactivities. And we compared the trawled site to the untrawled site. So that here, any negative percentages show a depletion in the trawled site in comparison to the untrawled site for each sampling period. So as you can see, there is a preferential depletion of the most reactive compounds. But as in the previous slide, I showed that there was winnowing of the finer grained sediment, and this tends to have higher organic matter compounds. We corrected it for, we corrected for grain size fraction, and we see that they are still significantly depleted, only the most reactive compounds. So, which shows that windowing accounted for some low organic matter content, but couldn't explain the whole, the lower organic carbon in the trawled site. So we further normalized it to organic carbon content to see also changes in composition. And we can see that trawled sites and the untrawled sites have similar, the organic carbon has a similar composition of the most refractory compounds, whereas the more labile compounds are still significantly depleted in the trawled site, which suggests that there's an enhanced degradation of labile compounds, possibly through mixing and oxygenation, but also through efficient degradation of the most nutritious organic matter compounds, as shown in Castellammare. However, these impacts were persistent through all of these sampling periods, even in March. So we collected the sediment core the day before trawling activities resumed. So this shows that a 2-month trawling closure is insufficient to restore the seafloor. And it was actually expected, given the low sedimentation rates that this deep sea site has, so that within this 2-month trawling closure, only between 0.05 to 0.15 centimeter would have been accumulated on the trawling ground, which is just not enough to see a recovery of the seafloor. And based on the sedimentation rates, we estimate that it would take at least half a century for these deep sea fishing grounds to recover. So the take-home message of this study is that bottom trawling hampers the preservation of organic matter, causing long-lasting impacts on the seafloor. Now, I want to explain the Portuguese margin, but in the due to time, I will explain this study, which was focused on the Benguela Upwelling System. And as you all know, here fishing is very important. And from all the different types of fisheries, bottom trawling is one of the most important, and it occurs between 200 and 800 meter depth. The aim of the study was to assess the effect of trawling intensity on benthic biota and the influence of sediment biogeochemistry. So that is whether this differences in sediment biogeochemistry were due to trawling or due to regional differences, and how that affected benthic biota. So in that study, they chose 4 different sites, and they chose 2 different trawling intensity, high and low. One of the bad things about this study is that they couldn't find any control sites to compare it to. So it's something else to take into account, that considering the long-lasting impacts, even if it has a low trawling intensity, it could still be enough to not show any differences between this high and low trawling intensity sites. In terms of the sediment biogeochemistry results of these studies, they show that in both in terms of sand and total organic carbon, there was significant difference between sites, so between each of these sites, and site in trawling. But the differences were deferred in each area. So at Namibia, Cape Columbine and Cape Point presented a decrease of total organic carbon content in the highly trawled sites, whereas in Charles Bank there was an increase in total organic carbon contents in the intensively trawled sites. In terms of the benthic biota, they also observed a reduction in that was more important in terms of the epifauna rather than infauna, but they couldn't discern whether this was due to environmental variables, so that is sediment composition, or if it was due to trawling. Now, the sediment composition could also be due to trawling, but given the various impacts in each of these areas, they couldn't discern whether these different environmental variables, TOC and sand content, were due to trawling or just a regional aspect. And the conclusions of this study, they highlight that they would need more samples at a greater spatial scale with different trawling intensity to better understand the impacts of bottom trawling and sediment biogeochemistry and benthic ecosystems. And something that I really appreciated about this study is this quote. So they mentioned that, well, the question that was the area lightly trawled because the fish assembly was different due to this different sediment composition. So is fishing behavior being affected by the sediment composition, which affects fish assemblage, or was a difference in sediment due to less trawling? And that is something else that still hasn't been properly taken into account so far. And another thing that I want to highlight is that the reasons behind the different sediment composition in each of these trawled sites cannot be discerned based on this study, because as I mentioned, and Castellamare, we were able to properly understand the different biogeochemical composition changes due to and by analyzing different proxies. So whether these changes we observed in this study are due to erosion or sediment mixing, that still needs to be discerned. So I just want to finish off with this map showing the very few studies and that there are several inconsistent results. So further studies are definitely needed. That this schematic diagram that I showed earlier only accounts for the physical and biogeochemical alterations. There still remains the question here whether this erosion of organic matter is simply relocating this organic matter towards another site, or is this during this transit time is it being degraded, and how is the benthic community structure how can we add the benthic changes in the benthic community structure to this schematic diagram? So with that, I wanted to ask if there were any questions.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Very interesting and comprehensive. We would like to open the discussion.
Hi, Sarah, I got a question.
Hi.
And so this is Justin. You know, I'm really critical already of this Nature piece that just came out. And one of the things in the new Nature article, for example, is I don't think they actually take into account natural degradation of organic carbon. They just take into account trawl-induced degradation of carbon, how much CO2 this releases. And so I think we already know, for example, some of the effects of trawling on the mineralization of carbon. We know that it can speed it up and it can lead to some CO2 release, but it could probably be argued that much of this is going to be released anyway long term. I mean, like you're saying in one of your studies, or in one of the studies you were talking about, you have more benthos in some of the sediments that weren't trawled. Benthos are going to oxidize these sediments. And so in your opinion, in terms of organic matter burial, which is what I think is actually more important here, do you have evidence that trawling actually affects things like organic matter burial, more longer term effects that we should be thinking of?
There haven't been any studies. I would have loved to do that during my thesis, but I didn't have any more time. But no, there hasn't been any studies, but I think it's bound to affect it, to reduce it, basically because in Castellammare, we see that that bottom trawling had uprooted aged organic carbon. So all we're is, I mean, it's causing a net erosion. So there is no net accumulation of organic carbon here. But what is the magnitude? Still not known.
Isn't there not just no accumulation, but actually a decrease in organic carbon? Because you are adding oxidant like oxygen, right? And thereby you are speeding up the degradation.
Yes, but other studies have shown that actually there is an increase in organic carbon in trawling ground in comparison to control sites. And they argue that because you're mixing, well, there are several hypotheses behind this. One of them is that since you're mixing, you're also bringing up old organic carbon. So there's, and mixing it with new organic, fresh organic carbon. So in total, you're increasing the amount of organic carbon. Other studies say that it's because by increasing the mortality and eliminating any bioturbators, in fact, the sediment mixing, the oxygenation is reduced in comparison to these natural untouched ecosystems. Like, we need more studies on this aspect. And what I want to emphasize is that we need more interdisciplinary studies, because all of this, they're all intertwined, and one explanation can depend on the other. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know what always bothered me is when you plow the sea bottom, you bring up more organic carbon that's very degradable. You deplete the oxygen rather quickly, especially in the Namibian shelf where you have a lot of organic carbon. Wouldn't there be sulfate reduction producing sulfide? In other words, can we make a link between trawling and sulfide production? Have you seen that?
I believe there's a paper out there that modeled this. But I cannot recall what were the outcomes actually.
I know a little bit about
give
it,
me a
I
hand.
guess.
I think he knows which one
Yeah, I think it was Sebastian van der Velde.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think his paper though didn't necessarily look just at trawling, so they didn't really know. Something happened. There was an anthropogenic disturbance, and it probably was likely to be trawling. And so in this case, there's much more oxic remineralization as opposed to anoxic remineralization processes in the sediment. So things like sulfate reduction. And so to answer your question, Kurt, in terms of how trawling would affect these pathways, I think it would actually shift the pathways more to oxic remineralization. And so you can argue that this perhaps degrades the organic matter more quickly. I mean, we actually just published a study the other day that has the same results basically. So more oxic mineralization versus anoxic remineralization. And so that would mean less sulfate reduction.
Mm-hmm.
I
So this is what I would expect.
It's bound to be different in different margins. As you mentioned in Namibia, maybe it's the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Well, they have their, not regular, but often they have sulfitic eruptions, which are not due to trawling probably, but to just the lack of oxygen and other oxidants like nitrate, and then finally sulfate, and producing so much sulfide that, and then methane even further down when the sulfate is depleted, that it erupts. So the sediment as such, without trawling at all, is already very sulfidic. Anyway, other questions, other people. Actually, I would have expected Dion to ask a question, mainly how much, or he might know the answer already, how much release of heavy metals is due to trawling, which increases degradation, heavy metals that are otherwise remain bound to the organic matter. Dion, are you still here?
Yes, good. Sorry, can you repeat your question?
I I would argue that trawling leads to an increase in the release of heavy metals or other toxic metals, because the degradation of the organics that bind these is now increased and releases the bound metals. Have you observed something like that?
No, our studies were just inside the sediment as such, and not in the water column. I mean, the last studies. So I'm not totally, yeah, I can't really tell. But yeah.
Well, that would be a simple experiment. You could do that in the laboratory, aerate and release the heavy metals, the less organic ligand you have. But that's for an RGNO course project. Okay. Other questions?
I was going to say that that has been looked at for some coastal, sort of coastal oxic sediments. And actually, Eleanor's plans to do sediment resuspension experiments in a way to look at what happens with respect to the organic carbon. That's exactly the model that she's using of studies where they've looked at trace metal release from sediments associated with natural resuspension.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Other questions? I like your approach, Sarah, to work together with the fishermen, and obviously they cooperated. That's also true in Namibia. A lot of research can be done through the fishing fleets and together with the fishermen. So that's an approach not to be overlooked. Anything else? Well, thank you all very much for participating. Mostly the two speakers, of course, for their presentations. And I would like you, Zara, to stop sharing.
Well, before I finish sharing my screen, I wanted to just finish with one more slides.
Okay.
Mentioned these two topics, but another provisional service could be deep sea mining, which also alters the seafloor. And as you may all know, that Namibia not only has bottom trawling, but diamond mining is currently taking place, and maybe in the near future, phosphate mining also happens. So there's still the open question is not only this one, but what about these impacts? Are they comparable? Are they different? Etc.
Yeah, great that you mentioned that, because that's actually a hot issue in Namibia, and trawling certainly can lead to get some results about possible consequences of disturbing the bottom of the ocean. Thank you for mentioning that. If other people would be here who are more involved in phosphate or deep sea mining, not just phosphorus, but others, they would probably have supported you in that, that outlook. Okay. So, anything else?